Hello to everyone. I had no fear whatsoever that we wouldn't have a good crowd for tonight. First of all, thank all of you for coming, and please turn off all of your cell phones. We're going to be talking about sensitive security matters. We wouldn't want to have alarms going off. When I agreed to introduce Dennis Blair today, I thought it would be a fairly easy task, and it's turned out to be a lot more complicated than I thought. I thought all I had to do is say he's a retired four-star admiral in the United States military, and he was the third director of national intelligence in American history in the Obama administration. But then as I got into this, the weeds, there's weeds all over the place. So let me take just a moment, if I may. Dennis Blair has been a career naval officer, descending from 6 generations of naval officers. He graduated from the United States Naval Academy in 1968, thus beginning a distinguished career of 34 years before retiring in 2002. Afterward, he studied at Oxford University as a Rhodes Scholar, earning a Master of Arts degree in Russian history and language. During his naval career, he served on guided missile destroyers in the Atlantic and Pacific fleets, commanded the Kitty Hawk battle group during an especially dangerous time when North Korea was threatening its neighbors in the Pacific. And he served as the director of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, as well as holding budgetary policy positions on the National Security Council. He concluded his military career as commander of the entire Pacific Theater of Operations, the largest of our global commands. Upon retirement, Dennis has continued to serve his country at the highest levels of responsibility. He's a distinguished fellow of the Sasakawa Peace Foundation, USA, a bilateral organization with Japan studying ways to ensure peace and stability in the Pacific. He's a member of the Energy Security Leadership Council, the Aspen Homeland Security Council. He serves on the board of trustees of Freedom House that works to promote civil rights and democracy around the globe. Between 2003 and 2006, Dennis was the president and the CEO of the IDA, the Institute for Defense Analysis, our nation's premier organization that administers, coordinates, and oversees national security research and development in all areas necessary to the defense and security of the United States. More recently, Dennis has contributed to the modernizing of the Naval Academy's curricular offerings in cyber education. As a result, the Academy now features one of the most sophisticated, state-of-the-art cyber programs in the United States. I trust, Dennis, that you were not consulted about the recent decision to remove 400 books from the Naval Academy Library. Since 2019, coming here, Dennis has been named the Not Distinguished Visiting Professor in the Peace, War, and Defense Department at UNC, and he teaches graduate students at the Duke University National Security program at the Sanford School, where he shares his considerable wisdom with the next generation of leaders. Tonight, or this afternoon, we have the great pleasure of having Admiral, Director, Professor Dennis Blair share his wisdom with us. Dennis?
Thanks, Paul, for that very overgenerous introduction. Early on, when Diane and I came here to the Forest at Duke, talking to someone, and he asked me about my background. I didn't give that, just mentioned a couple of things, and he said, one of these pips, previously important person. So I thought that was, there are lots of pips out here at Forest at Duke, which is a large part of why we like being here. A dinner conversation really goes over a lot of ground with a lot of people who know what they're talking about, and so we really enjoy it. But what I'd like to talk about this afternoon for about 20 minutes or so and then turn it into a discussion is the national security aspects of what we've seen in the first 100 days of this second Trump administration. So President Trump, candidate Trump, didn't really run on national security issues when you think about it. Didn't play that big a role in the election. He was running on dissatisfaction with the economy, some of it real, a lot of it imagined. He was running on these cultural issues, which many people felt the previous administration had reached on. But national security wasn't one of the big headline issues in the campaign or in his area. But my goodness, there's certainly been a lot of national security activity in his first 100 days. And how did that happen? Where did that come from? Well, part of the reason is that the national security area is where any president, has gained a great deal of power and a great deal of latitude of action. The Supreme Court generally defers, and the courts generally defer to the executive branch in national security actions. The Congress over the years has ceded a lot of its Article I power to the Article II branch in national security, some of it for good reasons. During the years of the Cold War and so on, it was important to get quick decisions, to move fast, and Congress recognized that. But some of it for bad reasons. Most congressmen these days seem to me are interested more in the blame game than they are in really thinking through national security issues. Just let the president do it. If it turns out well, we cheer, we were there all the time. If it turns out badly, we can point a finger. So Congress has ceded large areas of what you'd think, if you read the Constitution, would be its authority. Tariffs are a primary example in which the Constitution says quite clearly that's a congressional prerogative, and yet it's been ceded to the executive branch. So the national security area is one where a president can really run free, and many presidents have liked to have done it. In his first term, President Trump chose some fairly experienced and individually powerful and traditional national security officials. Secretary of State Tillerson ran Exxon for a while, pretty knowledgeable person. Former General Mattis at Defense and so on. And these experienced executives served as sort of a check on some of the wilder ideas that the president had. And as we saw, President Trump, over the course of that administration, appointed less and less individually distinguished, individually powerful, more compliant, more untraditional thinking officials, certainly in the Department of Defense, in the intelligence community. Perhaps Secretary Pompeo was a bit of an exception in the State Department. But so you saw that loosening of the reins within the executive branch on top of this overall loosening of the reins between the different branches of government. So when he came back into office about 300 days ago or so, or 800 days ago, 3 months ago, the president saw that it was an area in which he could pretty much run on a long leash without a lot of institutional impediments. He saw that probably good to put younger, less experienced, more compliant officials in who would do what he told them. He was careful to put them into place. And so we find that although he didn't talk as much about it in the campaign, he's really taken a huge number of personal initiatives in the national security area since he's been in office. So I think what we're seeing is primarily a product of this process. The president's personal instincts to go into areas where he has a lot of running room, to use the bully pulpit, to flood the zone, as they say, to put people on the back foot, force them to react to what he's doing rather than following traditional means. And we're seeing a lot of that in the national security area. He wants to be in the middle of the action, dominate the news cycle, dominate events, and this is an area where he can clearly do it, and he's made some arrangements with the people around him to do that. But nonetheless, some of these actions that he's taking, I think, primarily because of personal instincts, the unique way that he approaches his duties, are actually cutting across some real tensions that have been in American national security policy for many more years. So they're not just personal whims. They do reflect issues, tensions within America's national security policy that have existed for a long time. So, for example, the issue of engagement versus isolation. That has a long, rich tradition in American policy. Should the United States be forward, involved, recognize it has global interests, be heavily part of what happens around the world, react to most things going places? Or should we withdraw behind those two oceans to the east and west of us, relatively weak neighbors to the north and south of us, let things just sort of stew out on the frontiers, wait until things are really bad? Do we have to go back in as we did in World War I, as we did in World War II, as we thought we'd learn not to do after World War II? This has been a tension in American policy, and the president picks at that with some of these decisions that he's made. What about unilateral action versus allied partner action? That's always been a tension, certainly since the end of the Cold War, when the United States became the single superpower. There are lots of advantages to going on your own. You can go faster. You don't have to give up some of what you want in order to bring other people along. There's some advantages and attractiveness to it. On the other hand, there are advantages to having a posse with you when you're out enforcing the law. You may not be able to push as hard as you want on your individual areas, but you can have more effectiveness overall with more people. It can generally last longer. So this is a tension which this country has gone back and forth on, and the president is pushing it one direction. This idea of being a globally involved superpower with the traditional American approach ever since World War II is that we will simply not dominate, or we will not tolerate a dominant hostile power in one of the major power centers of the world. Not in Europe, not in the Middle East, not in the Far East. That's been sort of a foundational policy, and if you believe that, then you stay involved in those three big areas. You look for allies. You start early in opposing hostile countries that are trying to build up and push you out, versus thinking that the real sphere of interest of the United States is a lot closer, Western Hemisphere, maybe a little bit further. Other big powers can have their interests, but they don't really concern us as long as we're strong here. And you divide up the world into big power spheres of interest rather than spending all the blood and treasure and effort on maintaining a global involvement in all of these areas of the world. That's a real tension in American policy. You can make intellectually respectable arguments in both cases. So as President Trump indulges those instincts, makes these initiatives, acts with his personality, which is outrageous, pushing people, trying to expand things, he's actually cutting across real issues in American national security policy. So how do we figure it all out? Which of this is just froth that will pass? Which of it is going to actually push this country off in a new direction? Can this country be pushed off in real basic national security areas by one person, even with the power of the presidency? Or is this something that has to be more supported by the American American people, both branches of Congress, and so on. So I've always found to sort out questions like that, it's best to really look at things from a regional point of view, not to get involved in high-level discussions about isolation versus engagement and all. But let's look at the specifics in the different areas of the world. And the three that are most important right now are Europe, or have been important for a long time: Europe, the United States, and Europe, Middle East, and the Far East. So let's look at those. First, Europe. Until about, say, 2014, from the end of the Cold War till 2014, so 1990 to 2014, that's about a quarter of a century. The problems, both for European countries themselves and for the United States with its interest in Europe, were actually relatively minor. They were, first were the aftershocks of the Cold War. Soviet Union fell apart. How do you deal with that? And the United States spent an awful lot of time expanding NATO, trying to do it in a way that did not antagonize the Soviet Union, then Russia, bringing a new sort of order into Europe that was not based on this Iron Curtain going down the middle of the continent, but still had residual threats and concerns by a country that had plunged the entire globe into war at least twice in the 20th century and for many centuries before that. So that was a concern early on. That was really, when things settled down, supplanted by the issues of migration, immigration, the issue of terrorism. These were really transfixing Europe, and therefore were of interest to the United States. But these were not big war and peace issues. These were things that could be dealt with. That was the case until about 2014. And in 2014, President Putin reclaimed Crimea, took over part of Georgia, and really started doing something behind the rhetoric that he had been saying for some reason about how the breakup of the Soviet Union was the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, and his job was to correct that tragedy. And now here he begins actually taking back that territory in which the Soviet Union was supreme for roughly 50 years or so. Now, this was a new threat, but it was an old threat, wasn't it? I mean, that's what NATO had been set up for, to hold off the Soviet Union. So there was a strategy, containment. There was an organization, NATO, that had been quite successful in containing and then outlasting the threat to Europe from the Soviet Union. And so when in 2022, Russia took the next step of actually invading one of its former republics, Ukraine, the response was fairly quick and fairly familiar. NATO not only sent support to the Ukraine, it strengthened its own defenses, and its reaction was really a success. It stopped the Soviet attack, which was clearly designed to take over all of Ukraine after some gains. We all remember that column that was coming down from Belarus. It was headed straight for Kyiv. The idea was to take it over, establish a puppet government, and Ukrainians, having benefited from NATO training for years and years before that, stopped it in its tracks, killed it. And so the quick thrust to take over Ukraine was defeated by NATO action in preceding years, and then with NATO assistance, the front line sort of settled down where we see them today. 2 new members joined NATO, Finland and Sweden. We'd been trying to get them into NATO for years, and Putin got it done in 2 weeks. It was a terrific success. Virtually all of the European countries began increasing their defense budgets, not because they were hectored by the United States, but because they sort of looked next door and said, "Whoa, we got to up our game here. We need more resources," and so they did. So NATO went to the old playbook, reacted pretty well. And from the Russian point of view, Ukraine war has been a complete disaster. Destroyed their economy. Hundreds of thousands of their best people have fled. They've been forced to try to get assistance from China, from North Korea, from other places, and they're in bad shape. So when the Trump administration came in with this zany idea that peace is the most important thing right now, and we know better than the countries who are fighting whether they want to, peace usually takes the permission of the people who are involved in the fighting. They generally are the ones who know if they want to keep fighting or they want to stop. So this idea that because other people say war is horrible, they're going to stop was a little bit of a strange idea historically. But by pushing it and by using American power in back of that, we really risk snatching defeat from the jaws of victory and giving Russia a large part of the objectives it sought when it invaded in the first place, splitting NATO, getting a large portion of the Ukraine, if not all of it, putting themselves in a much better position for further aggression. So the policies the initiatives that this president, this administration has brought in Europe, I think are net negative. If they are successful, would make us much worse off than they are now. So let's turn to the Middle East. Since roughly 1990 or so, the first Gulf War, which was in 91, each new administration has come to the Middle East as a newborn idea. They all think they're smarter than the administration before. They all come with ideas. I mean, this has been people knew the plays in Europe. They knew the plays in East Asia. Mideast was a sort of a policy playground for new administrations to come in. And they'd make a try for about 8 years in the case of the Clinton, the Bush, and the Obama administrations, or 4 years in the case of the Trump and then the Biden administrations. And when you sort of looked at what they'd done during that time, hadn't really made much progress or changed much, but they tried a different set of things. So there was not a tried and true, accepted, widely understood strategy for how the United States deals with its multiple interests in the Middle East, free flow of oil, keeping Iran controlled, supporting Israel, countering terrorism. It's just a very difficult area. No administration really seems to have it down, so each new one thinks that it can do better than these people they just defeated in the last election. So the first Trump administration came in with its own ideas. It put no effort into the Middle East peace process, the two-state solution for solving Palestine, Israel, which all previous administrations had thought was the key to making success in the overall region. That's how the United States squares the circle between Arab states and Israel, is by a two-state solution in Palestine. So the Trump administration, and it's not the first ones, thought that this was not going to be necessary, and they jumped to this new idea. Well, it was actually an old idea, but they pushed it, of trying to broker relations straight between Israel and its Arab neighbors. Do not pass the Palestinian peace process, do not collect $200, just go straight to diplomatic relations, commercial relations, and whatever happens to the Palestinians, happens to the Palestinians. Nobody likes them much anyhow, so let it go. And they successfully did the first round of the Abraham Accords with UAE, with Morocco, with Jordan, without putting any effort into the Palestinian issues, and in fact, watching as the Netanyahu administration put more settlers in the West Bank, isolated Gaza, and just cranked down pressure on the pressure cooker and dealt directly with Arab countries. It seemed successful enough that the Biden administration, when it first came in, attempted to pursue that process. They attempted to extend the Abraham Accords process to Saudi Arabia, which is the big prize in that business, and they were on that until October of 2023, when Hamas sponsored this incredibly barbaric attack against mostly civilians in southern Israel. Israel reacted as anybody could have predicted, with its own very strong counterstrikes in Gaza that extended with the other Iranian proxies, with Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to a lesser extent in Syria, with the Houthis in Yemen, and it even extended to airstrikes and missile strikes between Iran and Israel itself. So out of that came a new situation. It certainly restored the centrality of the Palestinian peace process to a wider settlement in the Middle East. No Arab country now is going to say, oh yes, forget about Palestine, we're going to cut a deal with Israel. It also, however, showed up Iran and its proxies as being much less powerful and dangerous than they had thought to have been before that time. Iran looks pretty rocked back on its heels right now. When you add the Syrian events on top of that, you see that it's lost the sort of regional network it had in order to put pressure on Israel and therefore on the United States. So it really did create a new situation of both possibilities and of risks, but it was different. So what has the second Trump administration done now that it's come back in after 4 years out of the office? Well, it's kept its basic support for Israel with very few questions asked, and that's there. But it has also tried to not only broker the Gaza peace agreement, but think a little bit further into how do you solve the Gaza problem. And the idea it came up with was sort of zany, this idea that the United States would take it over, develop it, kick the Gazans out while the reconstruction was being done, tell them just to, live in a hostel for a while until we have this place prettied up for you, then you can come right back in. But nonetheless, many voices in the Middle East say, it needed some fresh thinking. There was just nothing going on Gaza. So they did take that a step further. It realizes that an expansion of the Abraham Accords right now is just not going anywhere. It's worth keeping alive, but it's really not going to push. And it renewed its policy. It's in the middle of renewing its policy of maximum pressure on Iran, this time with some very explicit military threats. Right now we have 2 carrier battle groups in the Middle East. There are pictures you can see in the paper of a dozen or so B-2 bombers lined up on Diego Garcia, and they fly sorties up towards the Middle East. So the idea is to put a lot of pressure on Iran, with the idea that perhaps there can be an arrangement, if not a formal treaty, some understanding with Iran that would make it less of a threat to Israel and aggression in the future. So if you pull all of that together, it's a fairly logical set of policies to deal with American interests in the Far East. It does not sacrifice our friends. It doesn't cause a split with our allies. So I have a hard time giving bad grades to what's going on in the Middle East right now as far as U.S. policy goes under the Trump administration. Now, I think we need to pay probably more attention to Syria. We don't seem to be thinking as hard about this very important component of whatever happens in the Middle East, for bad or for good. and probably Lebanon for the same reasons. But there is a possibility that things could turn out in a positive sense there. So that brings us to East Asia, which is probably the most important long-term concern. That's where most of the world's wealth is, economic development. China is the one country that can challenge the United States, has the wherewithal to do it. So what's been going on there? Well, for about a little over a decade now since he came to power, Xi Jinping has pursued a very comprehensive, determined, widespread program to make China the dominant power in the Near East, in East Asia, and push the United States off of that position. Now, to its credit, the first Trump administration was the first American administration actually to do something to oppose that Chinese policy. The president first started with his favorite tool, tariffs, against China, but at least it was something. And that was followed up by a pretty skillful set of officials in the National Security Council staff, led by Matthew Pottinger, who was the Deputy National Security Advisor with a good China shop in there. They pushed back against a lot of the Chinese aggressive moves that had been made in economic terms, in propaganda, in diplomatic terms, and they had really pushing back hard against China. The Biden administration basically continued and in some ways increased this pushback. A guy named Kurt Campbell was in charge of that policy in the White House and did a pretty good job of, again, continuing ways to check this across-the-board Chinese challenge to American interests and authority in the region. So I think we haven't heard that much about East Asia. There hasn't been a proposal that the United States turn Taiwan into a Club Med. There hasn't been an active. There have been whispers, but nothing from the president says that all we want is peace in Taiwan, on the Taiwan Strait. So let's put pressure on Taiwan to give in to what China wants. Haven't really heard that far. The early signs have been pretty consistent. China has certainly featured prominently in these wildly fluctuating tariff announcements of the administration. I don't think they've gotten below 80% in their tariff sweepstakes. So there's still this economic push against China. Commitments to strengthen the armed forces with a lot of emphasis on the Pacific, which is good. And as I say, we haven't seen one of these sort of signature, offbeat, zany Donald Trump announcements in this area of the world as we've seen in others. Perhaps the president's first 3 summits with Kim Jong-un were a little bit sobering in that regard, that he tried back in his first term, or it may be that it's simply he's happy with secondary performance issues like TikTok and some of the other ones that pop up. As I say, some pundits have been darkly predicting a sellout of Taiwan along the lines of the presumed sellout of Ukraine, but we simply have not seen that. So those are the way I size up the 3 big regions that really matter in terms of actual stuff being done. There's an awful lot about other moves made by the administration that are either amusing or troubling, depending on how you're feeling that morning. Loose talk about acquiring Greenland, the Panama Canal, even Canada, abolition of U.S. Agency for International Development and the Voice of America, very ill-advised personnel hirings and firings in the Department of Defense, Department of State, the intelligence community, and then just a lot of loose talk. I don't think Donald Trump realizes that if you're talking as the host of The Apprentice, it's kind of different from talking as the President of the United States. It doesn't seem that different to him. You know, same. I'm just who I am. Take me as I am. But the sort of loose statements he makes and then walks back and mind-changing stuff, just it's cracking a whip with a long tail to it that hurts the United States in terms of trying to provide an overall steady, determined leadership of like-minded countries, have them doing the right thing even though we're not watching them, and it's been hurting that. So there are specific things that are of concern, and an awful lot of commentary that you read takes some specific incident, extrapolates it out into the end of Western civilization, and I just think you need to be a little bit more balanced about that. So, as I sum up the areas of the world that really matter, I would give Europe, Ukraine, the area of most concern to me, and it's so frustrating because things are going pretty well and turned them badly. Middle East, I think there's a chance to go either way, but it's not hopeless. It might turn out better, and there's certainly no unbroken record of success in our handling of the Middle East for the last 30 years that gives you think. And in East Asia, so far the policies seem consistent with the idea that the United States is going to oppose a hostile country dominating that very important part of the world and push the United States off of it. So my overall assessment is not too bad so far when you really make your eyes squinty and look at the essential things. A lot of indicators that could go one way or the other, but those are things that I watch and that I would advise you all to watch as we go forward. So let's turn this into a discussion, and Paul.
If you have any questions, just put up your hand and I'll try to get a...
Hello, thank you for your presentation. Okay, how's that? I look at the world through a little bit different lens, having read all kinds of books about authoritarian takeovers of democracies. Many democracies have failed, and it's pretty predictable what steps happen, what steps have to be put in place before it gets the preponderance of evidence and the empire crashes. So looking at that, I don't think the president really cares about any of these issues you just raised or any of these areas. I think he just, my hypothesis is that he only focuses on what helps authoritarianism happen.
And the question is?
And the question is?
I mean, you have your opinion, everybody has their opinion. I just can't add anything to that.
Okay, that was one opinion.
Okay.
A two-part question. One is, in the Middle East, do you view the treatment of the Palestinians and just the bombings, the killings and all, as having potentially some long-term consequences in terms of growing a new group of terrorists or affecting our long-term relations there? And second, to what extent is the loss of international trust in the United States have some long-term consequences, and how would we recover that trust?
Now, those are really good questions, Sanford. On the first one, you know, the Middle East is a pretty savage place. The killing with extreme prejudice goes on, Arab on Arab, Arab on Jew, Jew on Arab. So I don't think the events of the Gaza war are going to make much of a long-term difference in trying to do these big things. I mean, it's awful to say, but that's kind of the way it goes there. On the question of trust in the United States, I think that is a more serious problem. There's a lot of fashionable punditry about, well, it's the end of the international order. You know, nice while we had it. Let's we have to move on, and I really don't think that that's necessary. I think the international order, representative government, some mixture of free market and government-controlled economies, some degree of free trade, a general respect for human rights and all. I don't see why we have to give that up. And within that overall context, I think most countries thought, you know, the United States, for all of its big-footedness and sometimes its downright malevolence or it's just ignorance and mistakes, it's probably about the best big country to have as most powerful in the world when you think of all the alternatives. And I mean, the guy who was the most explicit about this that I know was Lee Kuan Yew, you know, really gimlet-eyed founder of Singapore, who said basically that if you have to have a global power, United States is better than most. That was kind of how he, and I think that was sort of about as good trust as you can really get in international relations, that they're not going to screw us. They're relatively predictable. And although they think in terms of what's good for their country, they also have a little bit of margin for thinking what's good for most other countries, and they're willing to act in ways that are of the general benefit, not just in their unilateral benefit. And I think out of that overall approach, which the United States basically had, I think, for, you know, from the GIs passing out candy when they went into Germany and Japan through today was what our real, so you could call that trust. You could also partly call it sort of their estimate of what the United States was about. I don't think that can be completely changed in one administration, even with the sort of churlish actions that have been taken by this administration on particular things. But it does leave that doubt in other countries that maybe there's this other side of the United States that we haven't seen that could break out, that could make things. And in that case, we better look out for ourselves and all. I think that is a danger. I think most sophisticated observers of the United States realize that, number one, the president's, however much this president is in the saddle right now, as I said in my remarks, he's not the only person that determines what overall American policy is. I think there's enough international contact with Americans, official, unofficial service, that they have a more sophisticated picture of what this country is about than being run off by one incident. So I don't think we've blown it yet in terms of being the least worst global power that most countries, but we could.
Dennis, I'd like to circle back to something you raised early on, which is the historical tension between isolation and engagement, which I think may be the most important thing that we have to work out. My question would be, Trump didn't campaign on foreign policy, but really nobody did.
Right.
Is there any reliable polling information that would indicate whether the American public has any understanding of the difference between isolation and engagement, and which we favor? Because our representatives are getting no guidance on the matter. It may be one of the reasons that they have abandoned their role in determining what we're going to do on that stage.
Most of the polling that I've read says that Americans are as internationally minded now as they ever have been. When you ask them questions like that, I think the sort of fashionable neo-isolationism is relatively confined right now. But like any new and shiny, or actually old and shiny idea, it gets a lot of attention, gets a lot of ink, and it seems to have greater weight than I think it really does, according to polling data that I've read. On Ukraine, the polling is pretty clear that most Americans think we ought to support Ukraine and not pull out, so that's a pretty good indicator. All of the globalization has a bad rap in terms of some aspects of it, but it also reflects the fact that people are much more widely knowledgeable about what's going on outside their borders than they ever have been, which tends to, I think, make them believe that the United States is involved in the world. So it's a concern. And I'm not sure that this president is really isolationist. He kind of likes going to funerals in Rome, you know. Pretty good deal. He likes dealing with leaders on his own terms. So it's not that he is completely isolationist, but it's easy to pair isolationism with unilateralism and pull those two together. So I think it's a real concern, just like Sanford's idea of loss of trust. And with all of these things, you know, they're not inevitable. Depends on what people do, what leaders do, what citizens do, what events happen. And I don't think you can predict which way it's going to go right now. And I think that those of us who believe that we ought to be a generally reliable and leading part of the world, and we ought to be involved internationally, have got to act on it. Yeah, I guess we've got to follow the microphone. Yeah.
Dennis, I got a sort of a general question. My feelings are that we're going to have some issues to deal with over the next 10 or so years here in America. And I'm a person who believes in a more internationalist worldview for the United States. And there's two questions that we got. One and the first, but they're related, so I think you can take it. I would be curious to hear your thoughts on how long you think it would take the NATO countries to get up to par militarily where they could stand toe-to-toe with the Russians. That's question one. Second part of that question is who might be allies for the United States in the Far East, you know, Japan, Indonesia, Australia, especially since it's a long way to get our weaponry out there, and the fact that the weapons of war seem to be changing radically just about every day with the AI, the standoff munitions that can take out a ship with no personal involvement by a pilot. So those are just two aspects. As far as the Middle East goes, kind of agree with you on it's still muddling, let it muddle.
So on the first one, the European countries, with or without the United States, have no problem in handling what they need to defend themselves against a Russian conventional attack. I mean, they've just got plenty. The main shortcomings in Western European countries' defenses have to do with projection, getting their countries out to another distance. As far as working within Europe, they're fine. And in fact, what's going on now in the most vulnerable recent members of NATO in the Baltic states, Latvia, Lithuania, Estonia, is they're building Ukraine-style defensive buffers on their border, barbed wire, mines. In fact, the Baltic countries are just about to pull out of the anti-mine treaty on very logical grounds that the reason that South Korea never signed. They're pretty useful if you don't intend to attack somebody, but you're afraid that one of your neighbors will attack you. Mines make a lot of difference. So I think the Western Europe countries, with or without the United States, can defend themselves against conventional Soviet attack. Now, where they're at a disadvantage, of course, is in nuclear weapons. British have a nuclear deterrent. French have a nuclear deterrent. Much smaller, warhead counts in the couple of hundreds. Russia has almost 2,000. Now, it's a complicated subject, but having a lot more nuclear weapons, no one has really been able to figure out how that makes you so much better, because having just a few makes it bad enough for your enemy, so he's not going to attack you. So there's all of that. And then there's of course, the psychological reassurance of having the United States tied in to a NATO treaty. An attack on one is attack on all. The United States has the most advanced weaponry. So I think Western Europe could defend itself. The disadvantage of the United States sort of splitting with Western Europe is more from the American point of view, really. Our history of standing aside from regional affairs in Europe, they really turn bad, and then the United States has to come in eventually and get involved. The old Fram oil filter thing. Our practice up until the creation of NATO in 1947 had been pay you later, and pay you a lot more later. With NATO, the idea of pay me now and pay a lot less and stay involved and just make sure that nothing happens has been superior. And so I think the important thing is for the United States to stay involved. And on the other side of the world, in East Asia, with the simple exception of Taiwan, there's plenty of ability for the United States, Japan, a semi-island Republic of Korea, the Philippines, to defend themselves. I mean, that's maritime territory. The U.S. Navy, if you had the Navy of Japan, Navy of Korea, it can keep everything safe. But then there's this Taiwan piece, in which we have a ambiguous security guarantee, and it's only 90 miles away from China. China has a lot more has a lot more weaponry, but it's an extremely difficult military task to take Taiwan. Think Normandy. I mean, it's that kind of that scale of an invasion that it would take to take Taiwan. Chinese armed forces have never done one. They don't generally work well the first time out of the box. In fact, if you look at history of World War II, they don't generally work very well the 15th time out of the box. This is hard stuff. So I think there is a military balance out there. I think that a lot of the weapons that are coming on into importance right now, drones, those are an ideal weapon for Taiwan to help defend itself. Hypersonic weapons from the United States make a great deal of. So I think that the technology can keep a stable military balance that makes it extremely high risk for China to undertake military aggression if we play our cards right.
Yes, Dennis, this is Richard Melanson. Can a rules-based liberal international order flourish without full American participation?
I never really thought that through, Richard, because I'd always imagined we were one of the good guys who helps build it. Let's see, do we have any historical examples? I don't really think so. I think it's really the big countries that make a difference, and there's no doubt what kind of a rules-based order Russia and China would like. I own my neighborhood. Everybody does what I say in that neighborhood, and I control my people very closely. So I think if the United States were really to were to withdraw, then it would sort of fall apart there. So I guess my answer would be no. And I hope we never have to test that.
Excuse me. This is not a question about countries, it's about people. What do you think the effect of making international students unwelcome in the United States will have not only on our international relationships, but on the capacity of the United States to succeed in science and engineering in the future?
It won't be good. It's just a question of how bad. I think it is. I mean, we've all read the statistics, the number of STEM graduates from other countries compared to those from the United States, the number who are employed. I mean, I've long been an advocate of if anybody gets an advanced degree in science, technology, mathematics, engineering, staple a green card to the diploma as they walk across the street. Now, the only thing that cuts against that is it is true that China has this program to send their young people to learn at the best American universities and then bring it back and use it to build better weapons and to outcompete us economically. But I think there are some things that we can do to deal with that. The ones we've tried to date, the FBI's program of investigating ethnic Chinese investigators, found some Chinese advanced engineers and scientists who were abusing it, didn't find a whole lot. It's really tempting to say, we just need to outcompete. We don't need to get paranoid about finding everything wrong. As long as American science and innovation and so on is rolling, foreigners, Americans, everybody, we're just going to roll over them. We don't have to worry about doing extensive vetting of everybody from a foreign country who comes here. But I think short of that, there are some fairly sensible things you can do in order to ensure yourself that foreign students in our universities, if they're dealing in sensitive technologies, are not just stealing it away, and I'm in favor of those. But it makes us awkward, doesn't it? Certainly not every ethnic Chinese here in Duke and Chapel Hill is a spy for China, but almost all the spies for China are ethnic Chinese. So how do you sort that out? I mean, if I'm a Chinese spy master, that's who I go to. I've got their parents, I've got their kids, I've got their relations. I can go to them and say, I see you're there at the Duke lab on biomechanics. There are a couple things that we need to know. It'd go a lot easier on you if you just, that's how the Chinese do it, and so I think we have to have some sort of smart programs that at least have some control over the issue of graduate students who are here just to exploit American technology or working in American companies. But nonetheless, we ought to widen it. I mean, the Trump administration has done one thing which all Americans say they want done, as a tighter border. I mean, they've done that part of it. But the other thing that almost all Americans say is, but we need a wider legal path to immigration. They haven't done. I mean, the idea, billionaires can get a visa, no problem. Well, so should, carpenters, smart people, the folks who are working out on our terraces. The United States does not have does not have a problem of unemployment. We have a problem of not enough laborers up to so we've got to put legal entry into this country on a par with closing the border to illegal entry, and we haven't done that yet. We've allowed it to be too much of an either or. So, can't remember. The original question was, are we hurting ourselves? Yeah, for a while, we are. Do we have time to sort it out? I think so. But can we do it in the polarized political process we have now? That's a real problem. What did I hear at UNC? 6 students were told to leave. Now it's 1. We're down to 5. So at least there's some sort of a process that's trying to sort this stuff out.
One of the pillars of strength for America, of course, is our military forces. And on day 1 or week 1 of the Trump administration, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs was fired. That may be too strong a word, but I think the word in the press was the chairman was fired, as was the chief of naval operations, a black man and a white woman who had distinguished military careers and had done exceptionally well and had served the nation very well. I worry, and I just wonder how this will work out in the long run, but I worry about the impact on the Department of Defense and the personnel who serve in all of our services. When I forgot the fact that we also fired the woman who ran the Coast Guard. These are bad signs, and it's scary to see it happen.
Yeah, I agree completely. In fact, I've only personally gone public twice criticizing the current administration, and one was on that particular issue. I wrote an article which was circulated pretty widely, saying that was a terrible thing to do, based on a couple of things. Number one, I've seen what happens when you allow politics to determine military promotions. You promote the politicians, you don't promote the blunt, skilled warfighters, and your military capability goes to hell. The other thing, of course, is that we have a very diverse enlisted corps in the U.S. Armed Forces. We don't do a whole lot, and yet it's roughly within what, and in fact, in some cases, it's more representative than the country at large. And you just can't have an all-white officer corps running a mixed enlisted corps. That's number one. And number two, it's a talent issue. I mean, the idea that the only successful military officers are white males is just nuts. You know, we just all know too many. I worked for General Powell twice. You know, I'd die for the guy. He's best officers I've ever seen. I didn't know General Brown personally, but he had a fine reputation. I knew Admiral Franchetti was working on all the right things in the Navy, readiness, personnel. She wasn't working on DEI. She was working on getting airplanes fixed, getting ships out to sea, getting training going, and it was just unconscionable that they were moved out with no explanation. No explanation. So I think it's a terrible thing. The other thing I spoke out on was on this, Signal chat group that are making raids, and Wes has flown off carriers, and if the people who run the anti-aircraft systems that you're going to be flying over know that you're coming, it's a lot more dangerous than if they don't. And there was no assurance that, Signal can be hacked. There's no assurance that the countries that could hack it, like Russia or Iran, we know they're supporting the Houthis. They could have gotten the information down. makes them feel good if we can get American jets shot down. So that was unconscionable. So those are the two things that I've talked about. And you know, I mentioned some of the other things. Establishing Voice of America. I mean, what are we thinking? What are we thinking? It was one of the most powerful tools we had. So there's these individual things that I think are terrible. But I try to look beyond those to what are the big pieces? Are they terrible yet? And that's what I try to talk about.
And Dennis, if I may, kind of a follow-up to Richard's question about whether a rules-based world order can exist without the United States at its center. We've noticed that the Trump administration has openly mused about the possibility of giving up the command of NATO so it would no longer be an American commander of NATO forces. He's also made disparaging remarks about NATO and our relationship with it. And in the recent Oval Office clash with Zelensky, he showed himself to be unbelievably belligerent to a supposed ally of the United States, and he consistently supported Russia's position with regard to the war with Ukraine. It seems to me that there's at least a hint that in his inner circle and with him, there is the possibility that the United States will simply abandon NATO and its allies, and that's frightening.
It would take more than just one president's idea to stop an international treaty. There's lots of public sentiment and lots of congressional sentiment for continuing to assist the Ukraine, so we'll just have to see how it plays out, Paul. I agree with you. There are indications it could go either way, and it all gets reported on, and those who have dark outlooks can get plenty of support, and those who have less dark outlooks can also marshal evidence. So I don't know where it's going to go. I know how I feel. I told you that, but and we all just need to work in our own areas to try to make it the right thing happen.
I know everybody wants to go to supper. I just have to say one thing. I know what your specialties are, Dennis, and we've concentrated a lot on internationalism, the United States' position in the world, the tension between isolation and internationalism. But I just want to reinforce, in conclusion, what David said. Many of us in this room, I'm gathering, are fearful for everything that's going on, not just, as important as it is, in the international sphere, culturally, taking over the Smithsonian, determining what the Kennedy Center should be, putting himself in charge of that. Reproductive rights, stepping backwards with that. You name it, there are so many fronts on the domestic front alone that are so frightening to us. Never did we think we would see anything like this bully pulpit and this bully in the White House determining who are the American heroes and what is the true American history. This keeps me up at night. I just had to say that.
Dennis, thank you very much for an extraordinary afternoon.